Our first speaker is Kerry Brown. Kerry Brown is Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. He'll be speaking on China's search for its strategic space, how China's national aspirations are expressed through its economy. Kerry, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words on this. I think I'll talk for about 10, 15 minutes, and I'd be very happy to have any points or questions. So China is in a very particular moment at the moment. It has gone into COVID-19 before anyone else, and was probably the place where this issue originated. And now it is economically emerging. There doesn't seem to have been much evidence of a second spike. There's been a recurrence of the virus in some places, but it did not experience quite as dramatic an impact as other places, despite fears early on. And the fatalities have been relatively low, not negligible, but they have been relatively low. The Chinese government can therefore say that it dealt with this issue relatively effectively compared to others. In January, you wouldn't have probably forecast that. At that time, this seemed to be emerging as a regional issue like SARS 15, 20 years ago. In particular, there was lots of concern in the outside world that China would be overwhelmed by this issue, that its governance system wouldn't be able to cope. And indeed, at the end of January, Xi Jinping disappeared for a few days, reportedly, and there was great anxiety that this presaged some kind of enormous problem within the elite. However, really since February, as the problem spread to the outside world, China has, in some ways, somewhat unfortunately, because it's not a great thing, obviously, for anyone to suffer from, but it has emerged from this issue with its governance system strangely emboldened. By that I mean that it's extremely quick, mean measures after the problem initially emerged, and there were serious issues then, but after the kind of problems at the very beginning, its impositions of curfews or lockdowns, its use of masks, its tracing and tracking, these kinds of things proved effective. The issue was heavy in some parts of China, particularly Wuhan, where it originated, but it certainly didn't spread nationally anything like the ways we've seen in other places in Europe or America. Now, of course, this has a massive geopolitical impact, and we can't really ignore that. It has raised awareness of China in many places. Before, I think in Europe and America, China was important, certainly in the United States, but in parts of Europe, it didn't have the prominence that probably it needs as the world's second biggest economy and a fifth of global GDP. However, because of COVID-19, a whole host of other issues have come along about what do we do in a world in which such a significant player clearly has a very, very different view of how things should run. A complex view. In some ways, China remains a good partner in combating climate change, indeed in public health issues, where researchers from inside and outside China have been working together in all sorts of different areas where there are generic problems. China remains a significant partner, and in some ways an increasingly important partner. In terms of technology and intellectual property, we've seen a real kind of transformation. Chinese universities now are rising into the world's top 20 according to the Times Higher Educational Supplement listing. First time, big winners this year. And I think that is indicative of the way in which China is in many areas no longer in technology deficit or intellectual property deficit with West. By West, I mean Europe and America principally, but of course embracing others like Australia and New Zealand. So this is a really, really big and fundamental change, that China is no longer kind of really easily seen as a power which is somehow coming to get intellectual property from others. In many ways, it's probably a potential target of intellectual property scrutiny, and to try and get things the world doesn't have from China rather than China the other way around. So this kind of big transformation in China's image in the world, which has made it more complex, more contentious. This, clearly has, I think, a long-term significance. This is not just about COVID-19. What we're seeing is a far deeper awareness of what the China challenge is, and a sort of emergence of this very big debate about what to do about it. On the first, what kind of challenge China is, I can say that this is a pretty stark issue. On the one hand, a fifth of humanity and a fifth of global GDP exists under a system which is certainly not shared by much of the rest of the world. And it is not looking likely to change any day soon. I'm not going to make predictions about what might happen 10 or 15 years down the line. All I can say is at the moment, you would say that the Chinese governance system is shown to have worked, at least for China. Whether it wishes this system to be exported elsewhere, I think is a totally different question. I don't think that is the case. But I mean, certainly Xi Jinping, if we were standing for re-election in China today, would be able to say that socialism with Chinese characteristics works because it deals with pandemics better. It restores your economy to growth a bit quicker than others when you've had a hit like this. And it just seems to give people a broader, more optimistic sense going forward. And at least on the surface, looks like it deals with contention in, I would say, a more efficient way. I wouldn't say a better way. I mean, certainly when you think of the very, very serious problems in particularly America at the moment with divisions and elsewhere, China offers a sort of strange unity, at least in its public face. So these kind of issues are systemic, very profound, and very, very difficult to see an easy way through. I suppose the second thing we have to kind of acknowledge in this moment is that the economic impact of COVID-19, and that's the sort of space we're moving into now, after the initial enormous problem of the public health crisis. It doesn't recede, but it certainly becomes more, I suppose, more normalized, and people have got regimes in order to try and deal with it, even if they can't completely conquer it. I mean, as we move into this period, the economics becomes the battleground. And in a sense, that means that China is playing on home territory, because that's really where it's been most successful in the last 30 years, its ability to produce growth and jobs. And so the kind of stimulus package, if you call it that the parliament in China passed in May, the kind of attempt to create 9 million urban jobs, the focus on just trying to kind of get things rebooted to growth, which has so far resulted in just above 3% growth after a pretty dreadful first quarter, means that China is now sort of really kind of making advances in trying to get where I think many others are also going to try and get to, a sort of restoration and a kind of revivification of its economic kind of a sort of powers. Now, this is where I think things are going to be quite difficult, to say the least, because I think there are broadly three scenarios. One is that China succeeds in this and the rest of the world suffers, goes into a recession, even a depression. And then you have a kind of enormous rebalancing where China's powers increase significantly, and maybe it becomes the world's biggest economy in growth terms far quicker than people expected, sometime in the next decade. Well, that's kind of creating a lot of division, I suppose, and a lot of particularly resentful views towards China. It ends up with China very powerful, but with a world around it which probably doesn't feel very happy about this, particularly the circumstances by which it's happened. So the second is that broadly, China suffers worse than people expected. It's not clear at the moment. Maybe there will be some profounder and bigger problems that it faces. Its economy declines unexpectedly. The rest of the world gets ahead a bit easier. America and the Europeans are able to restore their kind of jobs and GDP and deal with their problems. So I guess we can then have people going around saying, well, this proves that we were always right, and it was just a matter of time before we could really celebrate the end of history with the victory of the liberal democratic means. Now, that doesn't look particularly likely at the moment. I'm not saying it's impossible, but my money wouldn't be on it. I mean, it seems that there's a lot of ground for the rest of the world to make up, and there's not so much ground for China to lose. I mean, there's a lot of ground for China to lose in order for it to collapse the way that that would need to happen. So I think the second scenario is not super likely. The ideal scenario, I suppose, is that pragmatism and the economic crisis that pretty much everyone is facing means that they, for once, do have a shared language. Um, this means that they all are able to talk the language of job creation, of trying to restore their economies, raise consumption, and do something about their inflation problems, all of the things that we are hitting across the board. It means that the world and China are forced to talk a more common language just for pragmatic reasons, even though they don't agree with each other on other issues, and that they are able to at least identify areas of generic interest and importance where they can work together and be clearer to themselves about where they can't work together. One of the issues of the era that we're emerging from, I suppose, is that I think that there was this general idea that China and the United States and others were obligated to work with each other across the board, and the boundaries weren't very clear. I'm not talking about a new Cold War here, but what I mean is that I think there needs to be clarity in a sort of number of different levels about where one can and one can't work with China, and where China can and can't work with partners, particularly in Europe and America, the two other largest economies. Um, this means a fairly multi-layered and multifaceted system, a not particularly elegant system. It's not got the kind of brutal elegance or brutal simplicity of the Cold War era, where there was a them and us. What it means is that there are areas in which Chinese and non-Chinese work in partnership, and that's kind of happening with, for instance, research on viruses for obvious reasons. And there are other areas where, in telecoms, for instance, with Huawei, where the world divides, and it divides in a sort of almost like a sector by sector, step by step process. So I suppose my conclusion would be that COVID-19 has accelerated something that one should have expected earlier, maybe even from the beginning of the Trump presidency in 2017. And that is a kind of division, not a division in a fractious sense, but a sense that there is a lack of alignment between China and the Americans and Europeans in particular. And this can't continue to be denied. But there's also no way in which they can completely ignore each other. That would be impossible. The idea of a total decoupling makes no sense. Um, One final thing, I suppose, is that, as some have probably observed, at least in the worlds of finance and capital flows, I mean, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and others, just been mentioned, um, are finding China opening up. Um, this is sort of something about the kind of strange complexity of China that, well, at times when everyone is complaining about how hard it is to do stuff there. I mean, the EU Chamber of Commerce yesterday issued their very good annual report, um, and all sorts of issues about European companies, market access, things that have been known for a long, long time. More serious issues emerging, security of personnel in China, and fears about people being taken in, the Huawei kind of instance in Canada, with the chief finance officer being taken in, and then the two Canadians taken in Canada. It seems to be connected. The two seem to be very, very closely connected. There's worries that this sort of pattern will continue. There are concerns, of course, about the states of Hong Kong. There are concerns about Xinjiang. There are concerns about a whole raft of things. And those don't go away, and I wouldn't deny their kind of significance. However, there are clearly areas in which China is absolutely aware of the use and importance of the world working with it, and is willing to grant more access to its domestic sectors. Life sciences and healthcare, for instance, are also ones where perhaps we can have a much, much better dialogue now. and where, in fact, China is relatively liberal in the sense that its companies going abroad have mostly been non-state and have mostly been able to work under the supervision of the sort of state control, but not its management. They have been left to do maybe things more to their own advantage. So there's sort of a complexity about this that I think we've got to get used to. And my conclusion would be that the great decoupling, I think, is going to be maybe a recoupling in some areas, more intense than ever. It's going to be a completely difficult sort of. It's not going to be. This is not going to be an easy, straightforward structure, but I think that it's going to be one that's led by the economics, the needs of people and how they identify those needs and how they identify China as being applicable to those needs, and pragmatism. I think we can probably give up a lot of our ideals, maybe about each other inside and outside China, but now I think probably focus on very pragmatic outcomes. And at the moment, I think there are plenty of them in terms of growth, job creation, dealing with this current very terrible pandemic. Thank you very much.
Great stuff, Kerry. That was really interesting. We've had a couple of questions from the audience. One is around sort of the US-China sort of tech sort of play at the moment. We've seen recent flare-ups around Chinese companies like TikTok and Huawei's 5G. Do you think these US moves will be at all effective in limiting China's sphere of influence?
Well, I mean, so the Huawei example, I suppose, is the most mature. And what it shows is that Huawei has been very, very profitable despite being locked out or increasingly frozen out of America, Europe up to an extent, and Australia quite early on. But I mean, Huawei is very effective in Africa, Latin America, and the Chinese market. And there are certain areas where Huawei is still able to do things it wants. So, I mean, I think the same probably applies to TikTok. The thing about these Chinese companies is what advantage they have is they have a complete control over the domestic market, which kind of bolsters them as they go outwards. Um, so I'm sure their business plans originally would have greatly preferred to be able to work in America, but I think that they can survive without it. Supply chains is probably more tricky, and already Huawei is trying to sort of adjust to that. I guess America, to be honest, is probably 5 or 10 years too late to try and do anything about this. I mean, it seems that these companies can continue to be prosperous and go forward without their reliance on American supply chains. But I mean, it certainly caused them some ruptions, but not a complete breakdown.
How do you see the tech war with the US playing out? Is this a multi-decade thing we're looking at?
Again, I think the pattern is that we're always 5 or 10 years too late, probably in this one, maybe even longer. I mean, as I said, China is no longer in technology deficit in a lot of areas. So for sure, it is certain areas that it's clearly identified as ones where it definitely needs to work, with the outside world and where there are better, technologies and better research. But I think that the listing of Chinese universities, yeah, these are just lists, and you can argue about how representative they are. But the fact that the Chinese universities this year, Tsinghua in Beijing, Beijing University, and others have appeared literally from nowhere. Not just them, but a number of others, Zhejiang University. I mean, this is the fruits of a enormous amount of government investment, and it's working. I mean, they are now globally recognized universities. I mean, if you'd have said 10 years ago, yeah, that would be happening, I think people would have been very skeptical. As always, China is quicker than people expected, and I don't see any massive reason to think that that's not going to continue.
That's really interesting. Yeah, another question we've had is, if there were a change in the US administration in 2021, would you anticipate a different posture taken by the Chinese with respect to the US-China trade disputes and military posture in the South China Sea?
In the American elections coming up in November?
Yes, yeah.
Look, I mean, I think most people understand that the posture towards China is shared across across the two parties.
Mm.
I mean, Biden in his previous speeches has not been soft on China. In fact, maybe the thing that has made it a little bit easier for China at the moment is that, in terms of efficiency, the Trump presidency has been fairly chaotic. So, yeah, I mean, it's created a lot of kind of pretty terrible sounding rhetoric, and it sounded fierce. But I mean, underneath, I mean, the assumption is that Trump is a self-interested businessman, and he wants a deal, and he's willing to kind of go for that. And with Biden, it may be more purely political. There is kind of going to be much, kind of more unity, working with international partners to try and sort of block China. So it could get worse. I mean, under Biden, it could actually be more difficult for China. But let's remember that you have to remember that this is a relationship that China has invested a huge amount in, and it's sort of fortified itself against big problems, but by kind of acknowledging areas where it will have to work with the United States and areas where it can't. So in a sense, it's already done the work that we now need to start to do. So it's in an advantageous position there.
And just finally, we've probably got time for one more question. Got 2 minutes left. What would you say the sort of biggest challenges are facing China at the moment over the next 12 months?
Well, I mean, so there's two. I mean, there's the geopolitical issues of dealing with a pretty isolated position at the moment. Its diplomacy has got to be re sort of structured, because it's certainly isolated. It's got issues with India. It's got issues with the United States. It's got issues with Europe. Very significant problems with Australia. This is a country that should not be as isolated as it is, and I mean, I'm not saying it's wholly China's fault, but certainly China has got to do something in its own interest to get out of this position. And I guess the second thing is just standard issue, but very difficult issue of restoring its economic fortunes after the hit of COVID-19. Now, I mean, there are all sorts of things, the levers that the central government have, which are advantageous. It's already started to sort of use those. But that's the absolute key battleground. I mean, my prediction is that if China is able to deal with that, it's going to be looking good. I mean, it's going to be able to say in a year's time, our system is absolutely viable. If the rest of the world is doing okay too, that's great. That's fantastic. All our systems work. But if China is doing okay and the rest of the world isn't, it can definitely say our system cannot be dismissed now. It deals with things that your system at the moment can't.
Brilliant, Kerry. Thanks so much for that. That was absolutely brilliant.